People who worked in HR, were you ever encouraged by your superiors to dismiss an employee's complaints? 24 hours after our youngest intern reported ongoing sexual harassment at the hands of her boss, the CEO personally called me into his office to pressure me to fire the girl. He introduced himself as Mr. Rogers and immediately started blackmailing me, saying, "Remember who signs your paychecks," and "HR exists only to protect the company, not the employees." When I told him I couldn't overlook the allegations solely because the accused person was his son, he got in my face. "You have a mortgage and kids in college. Don't throw that away for some girl you don't know," he yelled at me. That evening, he walked into my office and said, "Start documenting that girl's performance issues. Late arrivals, attitude problems, whatever you need to smoothly let her go." He handed me a pre-written report card clearing his son's name before walking out while his son watched us smirking from the doorway. He was forcing the intern girl to stay late with him in his office tonight. The next morning, I called the intern into my office. She walked in looking exhausted and defeated. I pulled out my notepad and started writing. "Tell me all about yesterday's incident," I said flatly. She started crying halfway through her story, talking about how he'd pinned her hips against his desk, but I kept writing, my face emotionless. When she finished, I looked up blankly. "These investigations rarely find anything conclusive. You understand that, right?" Her face crumpled. "I knew it. You're just like every other HR department." She stood up to leave. "Sit down," I told her coldly. "We're not done here." I pulled up her file on my computer. "You were late Tuesday by 3 minutes. You didn't attend the optional team lunch on Monday." She stared at me in disbelief. "Those weren't required," I cut her off. "You used the wrong cover sheet on the Johnson report." I typed each infraction into the system while she watched. "Your attitude in meetings has been noted as problematic." She started crying again. "This is retaliation. You know this is retaliation." I looked at her without expression. "I'm documenting facts, and that's my job." The CEO stopped by that same afternoon. "How's our little problem progressing?" I showed him the performance documentation I'd been building. "Perfect. She'll be gone by Friday. Make sure you get her signature on everything. We need this airtight." After he left, I called his son into my office. "Don't worry about any of this," I told him. "It'll blow over. These things always do. The investigation will find nothing." He laughed. "My dad owns this place. Of course it won't." I smiled at him. "Exactly." Wednesday, I escalated my documentation. I wrote up the intern for her unprofessional appearance when she wore the same blazer 2 days in a row, for taking 4 minutes in the bathroom, for not smiling during the morning stand-up. I called her in to sign the write-ups. "This is insane," she said. "You're destroying my career over nothing." I slid the papers across to her. "Sign them or be terminated immediately for insubordination." She signed them with shaking hands. Thursday morning, I had her supervisor send me more ammunition. Every minor mistake from her 3 months here. Every time she asked a question that could be seen as not knowing her job. Every lunch break that ran 1 minute over. I compiled it all into a thick folder. The CEO was ecstatic when I showed him. "This is beautiful." No one would ever believe her over this documentation. His son had started openly mocking the intern in the hallways, knowing she was gone tomorrow. I scheduled the termination meeting for Friday at 10, sent the invite to the CEO, his son, the executive team, and the intern. "Mandatory meeting regarding performance review," the subject line read. The intern messaged me Thursday night. "Please don't do this. I need this job. I'll withdraw my complaint." I didn't respond. Friday morning, everyone gathered in the conference room. The intern sat alone on one side of the table. The CEO, his son, and 3 executives sat on the other. I walked in carrying 2 folders, one thick, one thin. The intern looked at the thick folder and started crying before I even opened my mouth. "Let's get this over with," the CEO said. "Present your findings." I opened the thin folder first. "This contains the original harassment complaint." The CEO smiled. "Which our investigation found unsubstantiated, correct?" I nodded. "Correct. The investigation into the complaint found nothing." The intern put her head down on the table. The CEO's son actually laughed. Then I opened the thick folder. "This, however, contains findings from a different investigation." The CEO's smile flickered. "What different investigation?" I started reading. 4 previous complaints against your son. 4 women terminated within 3 weeks of reporting. Termination letters drafted before investigations began. Emails between you and HR destroying evidence." The CEO stood up. "What the hell is this?" "The end of your company." The CEO went red. And that's when I found out that leeches like him always have a backup plan. The CEO pulled out his phone before I finished speaking. He tapped the screen twice and security appeared in the doorway within 30 seconds. 2 guards in company uniforms walked straight to my chair. The CEO pointed at me without looking up from his phone. The guards each took one of my arms and lifted me out of the seat. The intern stared at me with her mouth open. The 3 executives at the table looked down at their folders. The CEO's son smiled and leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed. The guards walked me out of the conference room and down the hallway toward the elevator. Other employees stepped back against the walls as we passed. My phone started buzzing in my pocket, but I couldn't reach it with the guards holding both my arms. We rode the elevator down in silence. The guards walked me through the lobby where the receptionist pretended to be very interested in her computer screen. They escorted me all the way to my car in the parking lot and watched while I got in and started the engine. Only after I pulled out of the parking space did they turn and walk back toward the building. I sat in my car at the far end of the lot and pulled out my phone. 15 text messages and 3 missed calls. The first message was from the intern sent 12 minutes ago. I opened it and started reading. She wrote that the CEO's son cornered her in the hallway right after I got escorted out. He got close to her face and told her she just made the biggest mistake of her life. She wrote that he said his father would destroy both of us and she'd never work in this industry again. The message had 3 screenshots attached. I opened the first one and saw text messages from an unknown number to the intern's phone. The messages were from earlier this morning before the termination meeting. One said he couldn't wait to see me fire her today. Another said she should have just kept her mouth shut and enjoyed the attention. The third screenshot showed a message sent 20 minutes ago, right after the meeting ended. It said she was going to regret making him look bad in front of his father and the executives. I forwarded the intern's email with all the screenshots to my personal email address. My hands shook as I typed in my personal email and hit send. The company IT department could lock me out of the system any minute. I needed copies of everything before they cut my access. I opened my work email and started forwarding every message related to the harassment complaints. Emails from the CEO telling me to document the intern's performance. Emails from the previous HR director about the other women who complained. The termination letters that all used the same language. I sent 27 emails to my personal account in less than 5 minutes. My phone buzzed with a new notification. The company had sent an all-staff memo. I opened it and read that I was under investigation for accessing confidential employee data without proper authorization. The memo said I violated company policy and data security protocols. It instructed all employees to report any contact from me to the legal department immediately. They were making me the problem instead of the CEO and his son. I pulled up my neighbor's contact and found the name of the attorney he mentioned last year. Lorelei Birch. I searched for her office number and called it. A receptionist answered and I asked to speak with Lorelei about an employment matter. The receptionist said Lorelei was in court but could call me back this afternoon. I told her it was urgent and involved whistleblower retaliation. The receptionist put me on hold for 2 minutes. When she came back, she said Lorelei could meet me tonight at 7 at a coffee shop 3 towns over. She gave me the address and I wrote it down on a receipt from my glove compartment. I drove to the coffee shop and got there 30 minutes early. The place was nearly empty with just 2 other customers sitting at opposite ends of the room. I ordered a black coffee and sat at a table in the back corner where I could see the door. Lorelei walked in at exactly 7 wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather bag. She looked around the room and I raised my hand. She walked over and sat down across from me without ordering anything. I started talking and she pulled out a tablet from her bag. She took notes while I explained everything from the intern's first complaint to the termination meeting this morning. She stopped me 3 times to ask specific questions about dates and who else knew what information. When I finished, she looked up from her tablet and said I had strong whistleblower protections under state and federal law, but she also said the company would fight hard to discredit me before the board of directors could act on what I revealed. Lorelei explained I needed to file formal complaints with the EEC and the state attorney general's office right away. She said creating official records with government agencies meant the company couldn't just bury everything internally. She told me the company's retaliation against me actually helped my case because it showed their pattern of silencing anyone who exposed the harassment problem. Every action they took against me from this point forward would demonstrate that pattern to investigators. She opened a document on her tablet and started building a timeline. We spent the next 3 hours going through every conversation I had with the CEO and his son, every email I received ordering me to document the intern's performance, every termination letter for the previous complainants. Lorelei said documentation was my strongest weapon because the CEO's story would fall apart when compared to hard evidence showing what really happened. I drove home after 10 at night feeling completely exhausted. My wife was still awake in the living room when I walked in. She stood up and said her friend called earlier because her husband works at my company and heard I got escorted out by security. I sat down on the couch and told her everything: the harassment complaints, the CEO's pressure to fire the intern, how I documented everything while pretending to comply, the termination meeting where I revealed the evidence, getting escorted out and accused of data theft, meeting with the attorney and filing complaints. My wife listened without interrupting until I finished. Then she hugged me and said she was proud I did the right thing, even though it might cost me my job permanently. I told her I was scared about the mortgage and the kids' college tuition. She said we had some savings and her salary could cover things for a while. We'd figure it out together because what I did mattered more than keeping a job at a corrupt company. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Lorelei saying she was filing my complaint with the board's anonymous whistleblower hotline at 9. I got my kids off to the school and sat at the kitchen table refreshing my email every few minutes. At 9:30, Lorelei sent me a confirmation number and a screenshot of the automatic response. The system assigned my complaint case number WB 2024-0847 and flagged it for immediate audit chair review. Lorelei had documented everything with specific policy violations, citing Section 4, 2 of the Company Ethics Code about retaliation, and Section 7, 8 about executive misconduct. The automatic confirmation stated that Keith Walton, the board's audit chair, had to respond within 5 business days. I saved the confirmation to 3 different locations and forwarded it to my personal backup email. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived at my house requiring a signature. I signed for it and opened the envelope to find a letter from Philippe Masterson, company counsel. The letter demanded I return all proprietary information immediately and cease any contact with current employees. It threatened legal action for data theft and breach of confidentiality. The language was aggressive and clearly designed to scare me into silence. I scanned the letter and sent it to Lorelei within 10 minutes. She called me an hour later and said she was drafting a response. Her letter arrived at the company the next day via certified mail. She invoked federal and state whistleblower protections and cited 3 specific statutes that prohibited retaliation against employees reporting misconduct. She demanded the company preserve all relevant documents for investigation and warned that any destruction of evidence would be reported to authorities. She copied the letter to the board's audit chair and the state attorney general's office. That same afternoon, Keith Walton sent an email to Lorelei requesting a confidential meeting to discuss my allegations. His message was professional and carefully worded, but suggested he was taking this seriously rather than dismissing it. He proposed meeting at his private law office rather than company headquarters and said he wanted to hear directly from me about what happened. Lorelei forwarded me the email and said this was a good sign. While waiting for the board meeting, I pulled out the termination files I had reviewed before getting escorted from the building. I found Catherine Doherty's information in a file from 3 years ago. She had complained about the CEO's son and was fired 2 weeks later for supposed performance issues. I drafted an email explaining who I was and what happened with the current intern. I told her I understood if she didn't want to get involved, but that the pattern needed to stop. I included my personal phone number and hit send before I could second-guess myself. Catherine didn't respond for 3 days. When she finally called me, her voice was shaky, and she asked if the company could retaliate against her, even though she no longer worked there. I explained about the whistleblower protections and the board investigation. I told her the intern was going through exactly what she went through and that her testimony could help stop it from happening to anyone else. She was quiet for a long time before saying she would think about it. The next morning, she sent me an email saying she would talk. She spent that day writing everything down and sent me a sworn statement that evening. Her statement described how the son trapped her alone in the supply room 3 years ago and pressed against her while blocking the door. She wrote about reporting it to the previous HR director, who told her she must have misunderstood his friendly nature. She included the date of her complaint and the date of her termination exactly 2 weeks later. I compared her termination letter to the one I had been preparing for the intern. The language was almost identical down to specific phrases about attitude problems and missed deadlines. Both letters mentioned failure to smile during meetings and taking too long at lunch. Both cited unprofessional appearance and questioned ability to handle job responsibilities. The template approach made the retaliation pattern impossible to deny. I sent everything to Lorelei, who said this was exactly what we needed. I arranged to meet the intern at a library branch far from the office, bringing Lorelei to make sure everything stayed legally proper. The intern walked in looking exhausted but carrying a folder thick with papers. She sat down across from us and opened the folder. She had been keeping detailed notes since the harassment started 2 months ago. Every page listed dates, times, and exactly what the son said during each incident. Her records showed he started with comments about her appearance in early September and escalated to touching her shoulder by mid-October. By November, he was finding reasons to keep her late and standing too close in empty conference rooms. The physical contact got more aggressive over 6 weeks until he pinned her against his desk. She also had text messages from co-workers who witnessed some incidents but were afraid to speak up. One message thread from 3 people discussed how everyone in the department knew the son was protected because of his father. Another message showed a co-worker warning the intern to be careful because the last person who complained got fired. The documentation was thorough and organized, with each incident cross-referenced to her work calendar, showing when and where everything happened. Lorelei spent the next hour organizing everything into a timeline on her laptop. She created a spreadsheet with columns for dates, incidents, witnesses, and supporting documents. Each entry got cross-referenced with phone records showing when the son called the intern after regular business hours. The call logs showed 17 calls between 9 p.m. and midnight over the past 2 months. Calendar invites proved he scheduled private meetings with no other attendees, always in conference rooms on empty floors. Badge swipe data from building security showed he followed her to different floors during lunch breaks and after work. The pattern was impossible to miss once everything got laid out in order. Lorelei printed 3 copies of the timeline and attached supporting documents to each page. The evidence folder grew to 2 inches thick by the time we finished. Keith scheduled a meeting for the following afternoon at his private law office instead of company headquarters. He said bringing everything to the company building would tip off the CEO too early. The address was in a professional complex 20 minutes from downtown. Lorelai and I arrived at 2 p.m. and found Keith waiting with another board member in a small conference room. The other board member introduced himself as the finance committee chair. Keith asked us to present everything we had gathered. Lorelai connected her laptop to the screen on the wall and pulled up the timeline. She walked through each incident methodically, starting with the first complaint 3 years ago and moving forward to the present. The presentation took 90 minutes because she stopped to show supporting documents for every claim. Phone records appeared on screen next to calendar invites. Badge swipes got compared to incident reports. Termination letters sat side by side showing identical language across 4 different women. Keith's face got darker as Lorelai moved through the slides. His jaw tightened when she showed the pre-written exoneration report the CEO handed me. He leaned forward in his chair when the termination pattern appeared on screen. 4 women, 4 complaints, 4 firings within 3 weeks. The finance chair took notes but stayed quiet. Keith finally stopped Lorelai on a slide showing my conversation timeline with the CEO. He pointed at the screen and asked if the CEO personally ordered me to fire the intern before any investigation concluded. I confirmed that happened in his office on Monday afternoon. The CEO told me to document performance issues and get everything signed by Friday. His son watched the whole conversation from the doorway and laughed about how his dad owned the place. Keith wrote something in his notebook and told Lorelai to continue. The other board member spoke up after Lorelai finished. He wanted to know why I documented the intern's performance instead of refusing the CEO's order outright. His tone suggested he thought I should have taken a stand immediately. I explained I was building evidence of corruption while appearing to comply with the CEO's demands. A direct refusal would have gotten me fired on the spot, probably with the same fake performance documentation they used on the other women. Then I would have had no access to company systems and no way to expose the pattern. By playing along, I collected proof of the CEO personally ordering retaliation and his son's harassment escalation. The board member nodded slowly and made a note. Keith said my approach made sense given the circumstances, though it put me in a difficult position legally. Keith closed his notebook and looked at the finance chair. He said the board needed to hire an independent investigator because company counsel clearly couldn't be trusted to run an impartial review. Philippe worked directly for the CEO and had probably helped cover up previous complaints. The finance chair agreed, but warned that the CEO would fight any outside involvement. He controlled 3 board seats through longtime business relationships. Those board members would object to spending money on an investigation they considered unnecessary. Keith said they had enough votes to force it through if they moved quickly. The evidence was too strong to ignore. He asked Lorelai to prepare a formal presentation for the full board. 2 days later, the full board met in emergency session at a hotel conference room. Keith had rented the space to keep the meeting away from company property. 9 board members sat around a long table. Keith opened by proposing they hire an independent investigator to review harassment complaints and termination practices. He recommended someone named Jackson Walton, a former federal investigator who specialized in corporate misconduct cases. Jackson had worked on securities fraud and employment discrimination cases for 15 years before starting his own consulting firm. Keith distributed his credentials and case summaries. 3 board members immediately objected. They said bringing in an outsider was premature and would damage the company's reputation. Shareholders would panic if word got out about an investigation. The company's stock price could drop. Customers might lose confidence. The CEO arrived 10 minutes late and took his seat at the head of the table. He launched into a speech about protecting the company from disgruntled employees making false accusations. His voice got louder as he described how every successful company dealt with people who blamed others for their own failures. He pointed out that the intern had documented performance problems and the previous complainants all had legitimate issues that led to their terminations. Then he shifted his focus to me. He suggested I fabricated evidence because I was about to be fired for poor performance in my HR role. He claimed I had mishandled multiple employee relations issues over the past year. The allegations against his son were my attempt to deflect attention from my own failures. Several board members nodded along as he spoke. Keith waited until the CEO finished before pulling out his tablet. He displayed the termination pattern data on the screen at the end of the room. 4 women complained about the same person. 4 women got fired within weeks of reporting. Every termination letter cited attitude problems and performance issues using nearly identical language. The timeline showed complaints filed in January, March, August, and November over 3 years. Terminations happened exactly 2 to 3 weeks after each complaint. Keith asked the CEO to explain why every woman who complained about his son ended up fired within the same narrow time frame. The CEO said that was coincidence. Those were all legitimate performance terminations that happened to occur after complaints. The timing meant nothing. Some employees just weren't good fits for the company culture. Keith called for a vote on hiring Jackson for a limited investigation. The CEO's 3 allies insisted on a 30-day deadline and restricted scope. They wanted the investigation limited to current complaints only, not historical patterns. Keith accepted the compromise to get the investigation started. The board voted 5-4 in favor. Jackson would have 30 days to interview relevant parties and review documents related to the intern's complaint and my termination. The CEO stood up and left the room without another word. His allies followed him out. Keith told the remaining board members they needed to move fast before the CEO tried to destroy more evidence. Philippe called Lorelei the next morning, trying to set ground rules for the investigation. He insisted all interviews happen with company lawyers present and all documents go through legal review before reaching the investigator. He claimed attorney-client privilege covered most of the relevant communications. Lorelei spent an hour on the phone with him before hanging up and immediately drafting an objection letter. She argued his restrictions would defeat the entire purpose of an independent investigation. The board hired Jackson specifically because internal counsel couldn't be trusted to handle this impartially. Philippe was trying to control the investigation to protect the CEO. Her letter went to Keith and every board member who voted for the investigation. She copied Jackson on the email so he knew what Philippe was attempting. Keith responded within an hour saying he would address the issue at an emergency board call scheduled for that afternoon. That afternoon, the board held their emergency call, and Jackson joined by video to address Philippe's restrictions directly. He told them he couldn't do an honest investigation if lawyers sat in every interview and company counsel reviewed every document before he saw it. He said if they wanted him to work under those conditions, they should find someone else because he wouldn't put his name on a report that got controlled by the people being investigated. Keith backed him up by pointing out that fighting the investigation made the company look guilty and would hurt them worse than whatever Jackson might find. The board voted 6-3 to let Jackson run the investigation his way without Philippe's interference. Philippe sent an angry email afterward saying the board was making a huge mistake and he wouldn't be responsible for whatever happened next. Keith forwarded me that email with a note saying Philippe was panicking because he knew what a real investigation would uncover. The next day, the company placed the intern on paid leave while the investigation moved forward. She called me that evening crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She said sitting at home with nothing to do except wait was driving her crazy because she kept thinking about what might happen. She couldn't focus on anything, and every time her phone buzzed, she thought it was bad news. I tried to tell her that being on leave meant she was safe from more harassment, but she said the isolation and uncertainty felt almost as bad as what the CEO's son had done to her. She asked if I knew how long the investigation would take, and I had to admit I didn't know. After we hung up, I felt terrible because I couldn't do anything to make the waiting easier for her. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived at my house by courier. Inside was a settlement offer from the company proposing 6 months of pay and a neutral reference letter in exchange for my signature on a non-disclosure agreement. I read through the NDA 3 times trying to understand all the legal language. It said I couldn't discuss anything related to my time working there, including the harassment complaints, the CEO's orders, or how I got fired. The agreement covered conversations with anyone including reporters, lawyers, and government investigators. If I signed it and then talked about what happened, the company could sue me for damages, and I'd have to pay back the settlement money plus their legal costs. I called Lorelei and read her the whole thing over the phone. She got quiet for a minute after I finished, then told me not to sign anything. She explained the NDA was designed to shut me up forever and stop me from helping any future investigations into what the CEO did. The company wanted to make sure I couldn't testify if the harassment victims filed lawsuits or if government agencies started asking questions. Lorelei said she'd write a counteroffer that included special exceptions, letting me respond to legal questions and cooperate with official investigations. She wanted to protect my right to tell the truth if authorities needed my help while still getting me paid for losing my job. The company rejected our counteroffer 2 days later. Instead of negotiating further, they filed a lawsuit against me in county court, claiming I stole private company data and broke my duty of loyalty as an employee. The legal papers said I accessed files I wasn't supposed to see and copied them without permission. They wanted money for damages and an order forcing me to return all the documents I took. Lorelei called me right after the lawsuit got filed and said she expected this move. She explained it was a pressure trick to scare me into accepting their original settlement offer. Companies often sued whistleblowers to make them spend money on lawyers and worry about going to court. She said we'd fight it and probably win, but it would take time and stress. That night, I sat in our home office at 2 a.m. with bills spread across the desk, trying to figure out how long we could survive without my salary. I added up the mortgage payment, car loans, insurance, groceries, utilities, and our daughter's college tuition. My wife found me there staring at the calculator with my head in my hands. She pulled up a chair next to me and reminded me we had money saved and her teacher salary would cover most of our basic costs. She said our kids were old enough to understand why I had to do what I did, and they'd be proud of me for standing up to the CEO instead of letting him hurt that young woman. I wanted to believe her, but I kept thinking about what would happen if the lawsuit dragged on for months, or if we lost and had to pay their legal bills. The following week, Jackson scheduled my interview at his office downtown. I sat across from him in a small conference room for 4 hours while he asked detailed questions about every conversation I had with the CEO. He wanted to know exactly what words the CEO used when he ordered me to fire the intern, and exactly how I built the evidence file showing the pattern of complaints and terminations. Jackson stayed completely blank-faced the whole time, just taking notes on his laptop and occasionally asking me to clarify specific details. He spent 20 minutes just on the pre-written report, clearing the CEO's son that got handed to me before any investigation started. Jackson typed everything I said about that report and asked me 3 times if I was certain the CEO gave it to me personally. 2 days after my interview, Jackson met with the intern at a neutral location away from company property. Lorelei called me that evening and said Jackson seemed really bothered by what the intern told him. The intern had shared details she never mentioned before, including how the CEO's son grabbed her hip so hard during one incident that it left dark bruises she could still see days later. She showed Jackson photos she took of the bruises on her phone as proof of what happened. Lorelei said Jackson's whole mood changed after seeing those pictures and hearing the intern describe how scared she felt when the son trapped her alone in his office. The investigator asked the intern probably 50 questions about the timeline and exactly what the son said and did each time. Catherine Dougherty finally agreed to a formal interview after Jackson promised her in writing that he wouldn't contact her current employer or tell anyone where she worked now. She drove 3 hours to meet with him and brought a folder of papers she'd kept from 3 years ago. Inside that folder was the original complaint form she filled out when she reported the CEO's son for harassment. That form had disappeared from company files and supposedly never existed according to what the previous HR director claimed. But Catherine made a copy before turning in the original and kept it all this time. The form showed the date she filed it, exactly what she reported, and the signature of the HR director who received it. Jackson made copies of everything and asked Catherine to write down every detail she remembered about what happened after she filed that complaint. During his document review, Jackson's team found contact information for 2 more former employees who complained about the CEO's son years ago and got fired shortly after. Both women had signed non-disclosure agreements as part of their exit packages, but Jackson explained they could speak to him confidentially since he was working for the board. The first woman agreed to talk after Jackson guaranteed her identity would stay protected. She described incidents almost identical to what the intern reported, including being forced to stay late and having the son block her path when she tried to leave his office. The second woman was harder to convince because she was terrified of getting sued for breaking her NDA. Jackson spent 2 hours on the phone with her lawyer before she finally agreed to give a statement. Both women provided details that matched the pattern in the evidence file I compiled, showing the CEO's son had been doing this for years while his father protected him. Jackson's team spent the next week going through company servers and email archives, looking for anything that might show a pattern of cover-ups. The IT department head met with Jackson privately and handed over access logs showing every file deletion and email purge from the past 5 years. Someone in IT sent Jackson an anonymous email with an attachment containing backup copies of the CEO's son's chat messages from the company messaging system. The email said the son tried deleting his entire chat history the morning after my termination meeting, but the system automatically backed up everything to a separate server that regular users couldn't access. The deletion attempt got logged with a timestamp showing exactly when it happened and which account did it. Jackson opened the chat backup file and found hundreds of messages between the son and his co-workers over the past 3 years. The messages showed him bragging about getting away with things because his father ran the company. One message thread from 6 months ago had him laughing about a woman who complained and got fired 2 weeks later. He wrote that his dad would always protect him no matter what he did to employees. Another message showed him mocking the intern by name, calling her stupid for thinking anyone would believe her over him. He sent photos to coworkers showing the intern working late in his office with comments about how she had no choice, but to stay when he told her to. The IT evidence got added to Jackson's investigation file as Exhibit G, with the deletion timestamp highlighted. 3 days later, company leadership sent an internal memo to all department heads about the ongoing investigation. The memo named Raj Papas as the person responsible for mishandling the harassment complaints over the past few years. It said Raj failed to follow proper investigation procedures and made unauthorized decisions to terminate employees without adequate documentation. The memo claimed that senior leadership, including the CEO and me, had no knowledge of Raj's actions until the current investigation brought them to light. Raj got placed on administrative leave pending further review of his conduct. I saw the memo forwarded to me by someone in accounting who thought I should know what the company was saying. I immediately sent Raj an email to his personal address asking if we could talk. He responded within an hour saying he was scared and didn't know what to do because the company was making him the fall guy for everything. I explained that Jackson could protect him if he cooperated with the investigation and told the truth about who gave him orders. Raj agreed to meet with Jackson after I promised the investigator would keep his identity confidential in any reports. Jackson scheduled the interview for the next morning at a law office downtown that had nothing to do with the company. Raj showed up carrying a folder of printed emails and looking like he hadn't slept in days. He told Jackson he saved copies of every instruction the CEO gave him about handling harassment complaints because he knew someday he might need proof he was following orders. The emails showed the CEO directly telling Raj to delay investigations until he could find performance reasons to fire the women who complained. One email from 2 years ago said explicitly to make problems go away quietly before they reached the board or became legal issues. Another email instructed Raj to document minor infractions for any employee who filed a harassment complaint so the company would have justification for termination if needed. Raj brought his entire personnel file showing he received positive performance reviews every year until the current investigation started. His file included emails from the CEO praising his work and calling him a valuable team member who understood how to handle sensitive situations discreetly. Jackson made copies of everything and added it to his evidence file. The next day, Jackson sent a formal interview request to the CEO through company counsel. The CEO showed up to the scheduled meeting with Philippe Masterson and another lawyer from an outside firm. Jackson started asking questions about the CEO's knowledge of harassment complaints and his involvement in termination decisions. The CEO refused to answer most questions, with Philippe jumping in to cite attorney-client privilege and ongoing litigation as reasons not to respond. Jackson asked specifically about the emails to Raj instructing him to delay investigations. The CEO said he couldn't recall sending any such emails and suggested Jackson was relying on fabricated evidence. Philippe ended the interview after 30 minutes, saying his client had cooperated sufficiently and wouldn't be answering further questions without a subpoena. Jackson noted in his investigation record that the CEO declined to provide substantive responses to questions about his direct involvement in the harassment complaint process. The CEO's son also got an interview request, but his newly hired lawyer sent a letter declining on his behalf. The letter claimed the allegations against the son were part of a coordinated conspiracy to damage his reputation and career. It said the son would not participate in what it called a biased investigation designed to reach predetermined conclusions. Jackson added a note to his file that the son refused to be interviewed, which was his legal right, but reflected poorly on his willingness to defend himself against specific accusations. 3 weeks into the investigation, Keith Walton called a special executive session of the board with only the independent directors invited. The CEO wasn't allowed to attend because the session was specifically about his conduct and potential conflicts of interest. Lorelei heard through her network of other employment lawyers that the board was seriously considering removing the CEO based on what Jackson's preliminary findings showed. She called me that evening and said her contacts told her the independent directors were shocked by the evidence of systematic cover-ups and direct CEO involvement in retaliating against harassment victims. The CEO found out about the executive session and started calling his allies on the board to rally support. He sent emails arguing that removing him would cause the stock price to crash and invite shareholder lawsuits over hasty decisions made without full information. He proposed a compromise where his son would voluntarily resign from the company and the organization would implement new harassment prevention training for all employees. The CEO's proposal included hiring an outside consultant to review policies and creating an anonymous hotline for reporting concerns. He argued this would address the problems while maintaining leadership stability during a critical business period. Keith Walton received the proposal and brought it to the independent directors for discussion. He told them the compromise was insufficient, given the evidence showing the CEO personally ordered the cover-up of multiple harassment complaints over several years. Keith prepared a formal motion to place the CEO on administrative leave with pay pending completion of Jackson's full investigation. The motion included appointing the CFO as interim leader and restricting the CEO's access to company systems and employees during the leave period. Keith scheduled a full board vote for the following week. The board meeting happened 3 days later in the main conference room, with all 9 members present. Keith called the session to order and presented his motion to place the CEO on administrative leave with pay while Jackson finished his investigation. The CEO's face went red as Keith read through the charges of interfering with harassment investigations and ordering retaliation against complainants. 2 board members who usually supported the CEO shifted in their chairs and wouldn't make eye contact with him. Keith called for a vote and 6 hands went up in favor of the suspension. Only 3 board members voted against it, all of them longtime business partners with the CEO. The CFO got appointed as interim leader effective immediately, and security was told to escort the CEO from the building within the hour. The CEO stood up so fast his chair fell backward and crashed against the wall. He pointed at Keith and the other independent directors while yelling that they would regret this decision. He said he would sue every single one of them personally for breach of their duty to protect shareholder value. His voice echoed down the hallway as security walked him to his office to collect his personal items. I heard about the vote from Lorelei, who heard from Keith's assistant within 20 minutes of it happening. 2 days after the suspension, Philippe called Lorelei's office and asked to meet with her privately. She agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown, where neither of them would run into company employees. Philippe told her the board wanted to resolve all the pending legal issues through one big settlement that would cover everyone. He said the board recognized mistakes were made and wanted to move forward quickly without more public fighting. Lorelai asked what kind of terms they had in mind. Felipe said they were prepared to be generous to make everything go away cleanly. He mentioned the board was worried about the company's reputation and stock price if this dragged on for months in court. Lorelai called me that evening, and we met at her office to talk through whether we should settle or keep pushing for full accountability. I told her I was exhausted from months of stress and fighting, and my wife was worried about our finances with me out of work. But I also said I wanted the intern protected, and the pattern of retaliation stopped for good. Lorelai said we had leverage now because the board suspended the CEO, which showed they took the allegations seriously. She thought we could get good terms that would protect me and the intern while forcing real policy changes. We spent 2 hours drafting a settlement proposal that included either my full reinstatement with back pay or a generous severance package with a neutral reference letter. The terms also required the intern to be transferred to a different department with a mentor assigned and a 15% raise. We added mandatory policy reforms, including an independent harassment hotline that reported directly to the board instead of company management. Lorelai sent the proposal to Philippe the next morning. He responded within 4 hours saying the company would agree to most of our terms. The only sticking point was they wanted the CEO's son moved to a role without direct reports, instead of being fired outright. Philippe said they were worried about wrongful termination liability since the son was never criminally charged with anything. Lorelai called me and said that was probably reasonable given the legal risks of firing him without a conviction. I agreed as long as he had no power over other employees and got monitored regularly. While the settlement talks were happening, Jackson kept working on his investigation report. He interviewed 17 current and former employees over 43 days of work. The executive summary confirmed there was systematic retaliation against anyone who complained about harassment, and the CEO was directly involved in covering everything up. Jackson's team found evidence going back 3 full years, showing the same pattern repeating over and over. Someone would complain about the CEO's son, HR would delay the investigation, and the complainant would get fired within weeks for supposed performance problems. The report had a whole section just listing all the times the CEO personally ordered HR to document fake performance issues or find reasons to terminate people. Jackson recommended the CEO be permanently removed from the company and never allowed back in any role. The report also said all managers needed mandatory harassment prevention training, and the company should create an independent reporting system outside the normal chain of command. It included recommendations for individual settlement payments to every employee who got retaliated against. The report stopped short of saying criminal charges should be filed, but it noted that all evidence had been preserved and could be turned over to law enforcement if authorities wanted to investigate. Keith scheduled a full board meeting to present Jackson's findings to all 9 members, including the CEO's former allies. He sent everyone a copy of the 200-page report 3 days before the meeting, so they had time to read it. The meeting lasted 4 hours as Keith walked through every major finding and showed supporting documents for each conclusion. Even the 3 board members who voted against suspending the CEO admitted the evidence was too strong to ignore. One of them said he had known the CEO for 20 years but couldn't defend what the investigation showed. The board voted 8-1 to demand the CEO's resignation in exchange for a separation package. The package included 12 months of severance pay and benefits continuation, which seemed generous but was less than his contract would have given him if he retired normally. The one board member who voted against it was the CEO's college roommate who owned 5% of company stock. Over the next week, the CEO's lawyers negotiated the exact terms of his departure. He insisted his resignation be framed as retirement instead of termination, so it wouldn't hurt his reputation in the business community. The board agreed because they wanted to avoid a public legal battle that would drag the company's name through the news. The press release went out on a Friday afternoon, saying the CEO decided to retire and spend more time with his family after leading the company through a period of strong growth. It thanked him for his years of service and wished him well in his future endeavors. Anyone reading it would think he left on good terms, which made me angry. But Lorelai said that was the price of settling quickly. My settlement got finalized the same week. I accepted 9 months of severance pay with full benefits continuation for my whole family. The agreement included a neutral reference letter that just confirmed my dates of employment and job title without any performance commentary. The company also agreed not to contest my unemployment claim if I decided to file for it. Lorelai negotiated special language that let me cooperate with any government investigations without violating the settlement's confidentiality terms. That carve-out was important because it meant I could talk to regulators or law enforcement if they ever looked into what happened. The settlement terms got finalized over the next 2 weeks. The intern transferred to the marketing department under a senior director who had built a reputation for mentoring junior staff and shutting down any hint of inappropriate behavior. Her new boss made it clear from day one that harassment complaints would be taken seriously and investigated properly. The transfer came with a 15% raise that bumped her salary above what most people with her experience level were making. The company also committed to paying for professional development courses and conference attendance to help her build skills and connections in the industry. She told me later she felt like she could actually breathe again, without constantly watching over her shoulder. Catherine got a settlement check for $42,000, along with a corrected personnel file showing her termination was reversed and replaced with a neutral separation notice. The other 3 former complainants received payments ranging from $30,000 to $50,000, depending on how long ago their cases happened and how badly the retaliation damaged their careers. The company's lawyers drafted careful language saying they admitted no wrongdoing, but acknowledged the harassment complaints were not properly investigated according to company policy. All 5 women got neutral reference letters they could use for future job applications that just confirmed their employment dates and titles without any negative performance commentary. The CEO's son got reassigned to an individual contributor role in business development where he had no direct reports and no authority over anyone's career. His new job involved cold calling potential clients and preparing sales presentations that other people would actually deliver. He kept his base salary but lost the executive office with windows and got moved to a cubicle in the middle of the sales floor. His reserved parking spot near the front entrance got reassigned to someone else, so now he had to park in the regular employee lot like everyone else. The settlement terms required him to meet quarterly with the compliance monitor to review his behavior and make sure he was following all workplace conduct policies. 6 months after everything settled, I started my new job as HR director at a mid-sized manufacturing company about 40 miles from my old office. They specifically recruited me because word had spread in professional networks about what happened with the whistleblower case. The CEO there was a woman in her 50s who told me during the final interview that she wanted someone running HR who would prioritize doing the right thing over protecting executives from consequences. She said too many HR departments existed only to shield the company from liability instead of actually protecting employees from harm. The work felt different from day one because I knew management would back me up if I had to investigate serious complaints. The intern messages me every few weeks with updates about projects she's working on and skills she's learning in her new department. She got promoted to a coordinator role after 4 months and is already talking about applying for manager positions in another year. I'm genuinely happy when I see her name pop up in my messages because it means the pattern of retaliation actually stopped with our case instead of continuing to destroy more careers.